Hello and welcome to lecture 9 in the syntax lectures. Today we're going to be looking more into the structure of adjectival phrases. Now, before we begin, let's talk a little bit about the relationship between adjectives and adverbs. It's a fairly common idea that adjectives and adverbs are actually very similar kinds of things. In fact, some people have argued that they are the same category, they belong to the same category. That's the position I'm going to take today, and although I'm only going to be looking at adjectives, more or less the same kinds of things can be applied to adverbs too. But let me just justify the decision before we start and concentrating on adjectives. Firstly, we have the observation that adjectives and adverbs are often morphologically connected to each other, in as much as many adverbs are formed from adjectives by adding "ly" to it. Now, that might be seen as an argument that in fact adverbs and adjectives are of different categories, because "ly" could be taken to be one of these category-changing morphemes, like, for example, "ment," which attaches to a verb, as in govern, and turns it into a noun, government. However, there's reason to believe that that's not what's going on here, and this "ly" morpheme is of a different nature to that category-changing morpheme. For one thing, syntactically, at least, adjectives and adverbs are very similar to each other in as much as they're both modified in pretty much the same way. So you can modify an adjective with a degree modifier like very in exactly the same way as you can modify adverbs that way, so very quick and very quickly, or with these other kinds of things like as, which also can modify as quick or as quickly, and post modification with something like as lightning can be used in both cases. So syntactically they look very, very similar to each other. One observation that does seem to differentiate between them is that adjectives have certain forms known as the comparative and the superlative form, like quicker and quickest, whereas you don't get such forms with adverbs, so quicklier doesn't work. However, it's also to be noted that not all adjectives have the same forms as we do with some of them. For example, things like beautiful can't be made comparative with adding to it and get beautifuler. Instead, with these adjectives, what we have to do is have a different way of making them comparative, using the word more. Now, we'll be saying more about this and the relationship between the morphological comparative and this element a bit later on. But for now, the important thing is, with these kinds of adjectives, basically these ones are the ones which are more complex, morphologically complex themselves, or longer. We can't get the form of them in the comparative, we have to use the more. Well, exactly the same is true for adverbs. We don't have the form, but we do have the other, what we might refer to as the periphrastic comparative, using more, so more quickly. And it's perfectly understandable why we have to do that, because as I said, with adjectives, it's the morphologically complex ones that you can't add the form to, and you have to use the periphrastic more. And of course, adverbs are morphologically more complex than adjectives, having this "ly" added to them. Another difference between adjectives and adverbs is that they're used for different purposes. Adjectives tend to be used as modifying words for, or modifying phrases for nominals, so they appear within the noun phrase when they act as modifiers. Adverbs, on the other hand, modify other things besides nominals. That is, they tend to modify verb phrases or sentences, or in fact, as we will see, other adjectives. So in that sense, their uses are different, but that again doesn't mean to say that they are of a different category. In fact, if anything, that makes them more like something like the difference between, well, what in Hungarian is shown with the addition of a t onto a noun. This is the difference between what we might refer to as the nominative form, János, and the accusative form, Jánost. Note, these two things are morphologically different. We've got the additional t on the accusative, Jánost, and they are used for different functions. János is used as a subject, whereas Jánost is used as an object, and yet we would see these things as being more or less the same thing, just having different forms with different associated with different functions. Exactly the same thing could be claimed with adjectives and adverbs, that they have a different form associated with different functions, but they are more or less exactly the same kind of thing. So that's what we're going to take the relationship between adjectives and adverbs to be, and from now on then we'll just concentrate on the adjectives, knowing that more or less you can transfer what I'm saying about adjectives onto adverbs too. Okay, so let's start looking at the properties of adjectives. We'll start by looking at the complement-taking abilities of adjectives, and we'll see that adjectives are in many ways similar to nouns in this respect. One thing you can get when an adjective has a complement is a prepositional phrase complement. Now, this isn't very surprising, as most things can take prepositional phrase complements. So we can have examples like fond of travelling, keen on golf, and angry over the mistake. Nouns also are able to take such complements. Adjectives can also take clausal complements, so certain types of adjectives will be specified by taking clausal complements like certain, anxious, or unclear. And again, we get a range of different types of clausal complements, from finite ones, as in certain that he is lying, to non-finite ones, anxious for Bill to arrive, and even interrogative types with unclear who Mary should visit. Again, this is pretty much the same as nominal phrases, that nouns can take clausal or prepositional phrase complements. Now, one thing you can't find in the complement position of an adjective is a DP. And again, that is very similar to the way nouns work. You can't find DP complements of nouns, so just as much as you can't say fond Mary, you can't say a picture Mary either. And in fact, this is not just an accidental gap, because we can see that if we take a verb, which is a transitive verb, that is a verb that takes a DP complement, and we turn it into either an adjective or a noun, then we find that those adjectives and nouns can't appear with the complement that the verb appears in, whereas in other cases where we nominalize a verb, say a verb with a prepositional phrase complement or a verb with a clausal phrase, clause complement, we'll find that the resulting adjective and nouns can also take those kinds of complements. But for example, if we took a verb like to ignore, that's a transitive verb, and it obviously can have an object, a DP complement, as in he ignored the facts. And we could change that into an adjective like ignorant, or a noun like ignorance. Note, the resulting adjective and noun can't take an object. You can't say he is ignorant the fact, or his ignorance the fact. Instead, what has to happen is that that argument, in this case the theme argument, has to be realized as a preposition phrase, typically with the preposition of there. So he is ignorant of the fact, or his ignorance of the fact. What that shows us then is that adjectives and nouns, it's just their very nature, they cannot possibly take a DP complement. Even if they're formed from a verb that takes a DP complement, you still have to do something in order to realize that complement. as something, and what we do is we add this extra of preposition to make the complement more like a preposition phrase rather than a DP. So all in all then, adjectival heads are very similar to nominal ones. They can take the same sort of range of things as complements, and they both are not allowed to take DP type complements. Now, looking at the other end of the phrase and concentrating on the specifier, it turns out that adjectives in this respect are very similar to verbs in many ways. And one way to see that, or the best way to see that, is to start looking at adjectives in their other function. That is, when an adjective is used not as a modifier, as it is when it's in conjunction with a noun, but as a predicate or on its by itself, then we notice that they have certain verbal characteristics. Let's take an example, like John is tall. Here, tall is used as a predicate, predicating over the subject John. John is said to be the one who is tall. Here. Now, we find this kind of arrangement where tall or an adjective of any kind behaves as a predicate in other kinds of constructions. So, for example, we can get it with a non-finite clause as well. Non-finite clauses are always embedded, so we have to embed this clause inside another larger one and get something like, I consider John to be tall. John to be tall there is a clause where the predicate tall is an adjective, and John, the subject, is the one who's said to be tall. But now look at the last example here. I consider John tall. Now, what's that? John tall? Well, it seems to be a predicate, tall, the adjective here, with a subject, John. However, it can't be a kind of clause of the sorts that we've already seen, that is IPs and CPs. It can't be an IP because, well, there's no verb here, and IPs always have verb phrases as their complements. So if there's no verb, there can be no VP, and if there's no VP, there can't be an IP because the I must have a VP as its complement. Furthermore, if this isn't an IP, it can't be a CP either because CPs always have IP complements, and if there's no IP, then it can't be a CP. So what we have in this case then would seem to be something that functions pretty much like a clause. It has a predicate and a subject, but isn't any kind of clausal element in terms of its functional structure. Instead, what we have is an adjective and a nominal phrase. Some people have therefore claimed that what we've got here is just simply an AP, an adjectival phrase, involving the adjective as the head and this argument, John. Now, if we look at the full structure of a sentence like John is tall, John there would be in the subject position, that is the specifier of the IP. The verb be would be as the head of the complement of the inflection, in this case it's present tense, and of course the be and the present tense are going to get together to form the verb is. But we've also argued that the specifier of the IP isn't the place where the subject originates. It originates further down inside, well, the VP. So actually, before John becomes the subject, presumably it's inside the VP. But then that doesn't seem to be right either, because if you think about it, in this case, the verb to be isn't really the predicate. In fact, it's very difficult to think of what the verb to be actually means. Many people have argued that in this case, the verb to be is actually meaningless, and it's only there for the grammatical purpose of bearing the tense. English is a language where tense has to be stuck onto a verb, so we do need a verb in this sentence, given that we've got tense and that's got to be stuck onto something. So the verb to be there is more like a pleonastic verb, a meaningless verb that is there for fulfilling grammatical functions rather than semantic ones. Instead, as we've said, here the predicate is in fact the adjective tall. So one could argue that really the originating place for the subject John in this case is inside the AP, just like we saw in the case of I consider John tall, where it's just an AP with an argument in it. Note that that argument comes in front of the predicate tall here, and therefore presumably sits in the specifier position. So one thing we could say then about the specifier of adjectival phrases is that it's their arguments. The argument that the predicate adjective takes sits originally inside the specifier position of the AP. It then, just like other specifiers inside verb phrase predicates, will move up to the IP specifier to become the subject. So, like verbs then, the specifier of the adjective is the argument inside the AP, which eventually becomes the subject. So here we see a property of adjectives which is very similar to the way verbs seem to work. Okay, let's move on now to consider the modification of adjectives. Now, the kinds of things that we use to modify an adjective is in fact adverbs. So, for example, if we took Johnny's crazy, we might modify crazy here with an adverb like absolutely. Johnny's absolutely crazy. Like other modifiers, we're going to assume that this is an adjunct to the AP. It sits there, its mother is an AP and its sister is the AP that it's modifying. Therefore, just like other modifiers, this thing presumably is going to be a recursive thing, and you can keep on adding different types of modifiers to it. One thing about adverbial modifiers, particularly when they appear with verbs or with clauses, is that they have no fixed order with relation to the thing that they modify. Now, is this true of an adjective? Well, we can say John is crazy, absolutely. But then there seems to be something slightly different about this case. First of all, note the pronunciation is somewhat different. We've got this sort of pause intonation after crazy. So John is crazy, absolutely, is pronounced differently, sort of indicating that this isn't quite the same thing as Johnny's absolutely crazy. Moreover, it seems that it has slightly different meaning. Johnny's crazy absolutely seems to mean it's absolutely true that Johnny's crazy. In other words, absolutely here appears to be modifying the clause, not just the AP. And that would therefore indicate that adjectival phrases are modified only by an adverb that comes in front of them. That is, they're pre-modified rather than post-modified. That can actually be demonstrated further by having a look at an adjective in its modifier function itself. That is, when it acts as a modifier of a noun. Note here you can say an absolutely crazy man, but you can't say a crazy absolutely man. That is, if we're going to modify the adjectival modifier, it has to be modified by something in front of it. It has to be pre-modified rather than post-modified. And that is, of course, very similar to what we've seen happens with nouns. A noun is modified by a pre-existing, a pre-position of an adjective, as in a crazy man, and not by a post-modifier like a man crazy. So in terms of their modificational properties then, adjectives seem to behave more like nouns than they do like verbs, because with a verb you can get an adverbial modifier either side of the VP. Now, there is a rather strange observation about the modifiers which modify adjectives. Let's first of all consider a modifier like very. This is sometimes referred to as some sort of degree modifier. It modifies the degree to which some adjective is true. So John is very angry. You can also say things like John is very, very angry or very, very, very angry. This is called iteration, where you reiterate the modifier to add special emphasis. Now, of course, this is to be expected that you can do this if these modifiers are adjuncts, because adjuncts are recursive and you can add as many of them as you like. The same sort of thing can happen with a word like quite. Again, some sort of degree modifier, not quite as emphatic as the very. It means to a certain degree rather than to a large degree, but you can do the same sort of thing. Johnny's quite mad. Johnny's quite mad. Again, it's used to add emphasis. Now, if both of these kinds of degree modifiers are adjuncts, and they're adjuncts to the AP, we would predict that their order should be completely free. That is, you should be able to have very and quite added to the same adjectival phrase in any order. Now, there may be some semantic incompatibility there, given that they both modify the degree of the adjective to different amounts, but syntactically it should be fine to have both of them in any order. However, the observation is, apart from, as I say, the semantic incompatibility, is that it's much worse to have the very in front of the quite than the quite in front of the very. That is, Johnny's quite very angry is okay, at least from a syntactic point of view, but Johnny's very quite mad just doesn't work. Okay, so there does seem to be a restriction here on the order of the modifiers, and that's something that is quite unexpected, because modifiers being adjoined to the thing that they modify ought to have no different word order. Now, we're going to put that problem to one side and come back to it towards the end of this lecture. Let's look now at another kind of thing that first looks as though it's very similar, but turns out to have very different properties to the kind of modifiers that we've looked at so far. We get, along with adjectives often, these degree adverbs. They're a bit like the degree modifiers in as much as they state some sort of degree to which the adjective is to be considered. So John is so cute, or John is too cute, or John is as cute as something else. John is that cute. You can also use demonstratives here as this kind of thing. And also in interrogatives, the how that we get in how cute, it also seems to be a similar thing. Okay. Now, these, however, are very different from the other kinds of modifiers that we've seen. We've seen that with those modifiers, you can get more of them because they are adjuncts. And adjuncts can be added recursively, so you can keep on stacking such modifiers up. The same isn't true, however, for these degree adverbs. You can't say things like John is so too cute, or too so cute, or John is too as cute, or as too cute, or John is as that cute, or that as cute, or that how cute, or how that cute, or how so cute, or so how cute. Okay, these things just don't go together at all. And that would seem to indicate that they hold a unique position, that these things are not, in fact, adjuncts at all, but they sit in a particular position that comes in front of the adjectival phrase. Now, the other thing about these things is that they looked pretty similar to words. They're just words that come in front of the adjectival phrase. And a word which comes in front of a phrase and holds a unique position, well, that would appear to be something which is very similar to our notion of a head. So it may be then that we could analyse these things not as adjectival phrases with a so or a to or a as attached to them, but instead these words, these degree adverbs, are in fact the heads which take the adjectival phrases as their complements, hence they always precede the adjective. Note that gives exactly the properties of these elements. They're words, they hold a unique position. Head is always unique inside a phrase. and they precede the adjective phrase. Okay, the head is the degree adverb, and therefore the phrase that it projects is a degree phrase, often referred to as a deg-p. Unfortunately, we don't have an abbreviation for this because D is already used for determiners. But speaking of determiners, note that if this is the right analysis for an adjectival phrase, what we end up with then is very similar to what we've argued is the correct analysis of a determiner phrase. That is, that the determiner, which is a functional head, a head that carries no contentful meaning itself, that is the head of the whole phrase containing the noun, rather than the noun being the most important the syntactic element. Obviously, it's the most important semantic element there, but syntactically, it's the determiner that is the head. That head's a DP, a functional projection, which sits above the NP. Exactly the same then is going to be true for the degree adverb. They are functional heads projecting functional phrases above APs. Furthermore, just like other functional heads like determiners and complementizers and inflections, the degree adverb has a very restricted amount of possibilities for its complements. Basically, degree adverbs always have AP kind of complements, just like a determiner always has an NP complement, an inflection always has an IP complement, and a complementizer always has, an inflection has a VP complement, and it's the complementizer that has the IP complement. So this is just another extension of that general idea that functional heads take semantically contentful type complements. Now, as another observation about the syntax of adjectives, and this is this comparative and superlative forms that they can take. Okay, so we have an adjectival phrase like faster, faster than Bill, and also the superlative, as in fastest. These are obviously morphologically complex adjectives. We've got fast plus and fast plus ust to form the comparative and the superlative forms. Now, we can't get these forms on all adjectives, as has already been pointed out, because some adjectives are more morphologically complex themselves, and you're not allowed to have too many of these kinds of morphemes attached to them. So instead, what we have to have with these is this form of the comparative where we use more. Okay, so John is more intelligent than Bill, rather than John is intelligenter than Bill. Okay, now that raises the question of, well, what's the more? Well, one observation is that more cannot appear along with the so, as, to type things, which are these degree adverbs. Okay, so you can't say John is more so intelligent, or more as intelligent, or more too intelligent. And what that would argue is that more is in fact one of these degree adverbs, and therefore sits as the head of the degree phrase, taking the AP as its complement. Okay, so more is just another one of these kinds of things. Now that in and of itself then raises another question, and that is, well, if that's the structure of this kind of comparative, what are we going to say about the morphological comparative that is the faster type of thing? How does that look? Well, one thing to notice is that that too is in complementary distribution with the degree adverbs. You can't say John is so faster, or John is as faster, or John is too faster than Bill. Okay, so just like more is in complementary distribution with these things, so is the morpheme. And that might be taken to lead to the conclusion that is in fact exactly like more. It's a degree adverb heading a degree phrase that takes the AP as its complement. The difference between more and is that is a bound morpheme and needs to be attached to something. Specifically, what it needs to be attached to is the adjective. And therefore, what's going to happen is that the adjective is going to move out of its adjectival phrase position into this head position of the degree phrase and attach itself to that. So we're going to get faster, and hence we're going to get a complementary distribution between the more form of the comparative and the form. Only when you've got an adjective that is able to attach to the form are we going to be able to have that one. If not, the degree adverb has to be pronounced as more, a free morpheme. Now note, this makes adjectives in this respect very similar to verbs. We've noticed with verbs we get more or less the same properties going on, only to do with verbal morphemes like tense, for example. We've argued that tense is an independent morpheme that sits in the inflection position, and because they're bound morphemes, they force the verb to raise up to them, to stick onto them, to support the bound morpheme. So exactly the same kind of process goes on in the clause, with verbs raising up to the inflection position to bind the morpheme, as goes on in degree phrases with the adjective raising to the degree modifier position, the degree adjective adverb position to support that morpheme. Morphologically then, it looks as though adjectives are similar to verbs in this respect. Now, one last point about the degree phrase, and that is to do with where we find it. Is there always a degree phrase? Obviously, we've seen with these comparatives with more and the superlative with most, there's going to be a degree phrase because more and most are both degree adverbs, and therefore they're heads which head the relevant phrase. The question is, what are we to say when there isn't any degree adverb there? That is, what do we say about something like just generous, as in Johnny's generous? What kind of a phrase is that? Is that a degree phrase, or is that just simply an AP? Well, in order to answer this question, we have to start looking at the way other languages realise these kinds of constructions. We call the first two, as we've said, the comparative and the superlative forms. And in English, comparative and superlative forms are marked by some degree modifier, be it a free morpheme like more or most, or a bound morpheme like or est. It's always marked as such. The form without these kinds of modifiers, these kinds of adverbs, are like as in generous, for example. That form is often referred to as the absolute form. Now, if we look at the way in which other languages realise these things, we find generally it's the comparative and the superlative forms which are marked as such. That is, there is a word that you can see or a morpheme that you can see which marks the thing as being either comparative or superlative. In general, the absolute form tends to be unmarked. That is, nothing shows up along with the adjective to mark it as being absolute. But that isn't universally true. If we took, for example, Chinese, and we look at the way adjectives work in this language, we find that, in fact, the unmarked case is the one that relates to the comparative. So in something like ni hao kan, you interesting, note hao kan is just the adjective without any modifier or any marking of it. Well, that gets introduced. It gets interpreted as a comparative. That is, it means you are more interesting than something else or somebody else. Okay. If you want to have the absolute form, well, then what you have to do is stick in an extra word, hen in this case, which is often translated as being very, but the meaning of this, ni hen hao kan, is not you are very interesting, but just you are interesting, i.e. this is not the comparative form, but the absolutive form. So what we have in Chinese then is that it's the comparative that is the unmarked form. There is no extra morpheme to point this out as being the comparative, and it's the absolute one which is actually morphologically marked as being absolute. Now, that would seem to argue then that all of these three forms are the same. It's just simply a matter of which of them is marked by an observable morpheme. In English, it happens to be the absolute one which isn't, but in Chinese, it's the comparative one that isn't. And therefore, what that would argue is that, in fact, the absolute form really is of the same kind of nature as the comparative and superlative forms, i.e. they're headed by degree elements. It's just that in English we don't pronounce that degree element. Okay, in Chinese you do pronounce it for the absolute, but you don't pronounce it for the comparative, whereas it's the opposite way around in English. And what the conclusion we get led to there is that, well, all adjectival phrases are in fact degree adverbial phrases. It's just that sometimes the degree adverb itself is not pronounced, and sometimes it is. But they're always got a deg-p on top of an ap, just like we've seen with dps. There's always a d in front of the noun, whether or not it's actually pronounced. Now, that conclusion leads us to a solution to the problem that we noted earlier concerning these degree modifiers like very and quite. The idea, the observation that we saw was that there is an order to these things. You can't put quite after very. Very always follows quite. Now, we can account for this if we assume that very is the kind of modifier which attaches to the AP. That is, it adjoins to the AP level. That's going to predict that it is going to come after any degree degree adverb, like for example so, and that seems to be true. You'd say he's so very mad. On the other hand, with quite, if we assume that that is actually adjoined to a different place, specifically to the degree phrase rather than the AP, then that's actually going to put that modifier in a completely different position. It's going to be in front of the degree adverb. And again, that seems to be so, because you can say he's not quite so mad as we perhaps thought he was. Okay, so that then is going to predict that quite always has to come in front of very, as we've observed. Quite is adjoined to the outside of the whole deg-p, whereas very is adjoined inside the deg-p to the AP. And again, this itself is confirmed if we look at a more complex example, such as Johnny's not quite so very mad as we perhaps thought he was, where you can see quite comes in front of the so, which comes in front of the very. So is the head, and therefore that has a fixed position. Very, on the other hand, has to be adjoined to the AP, so it's going to follow the so. Quite, on the other hand, is adjoined to the deg-p, so it has to precede the so. And it's obviously ungrammatical to say John is not very so quite mad. Okay, that just simply doesn't work. Okay, so let's summarize the lecture we've had. Adjectives, we've seen, have some properties which they share with nouns. That is, they can never take a DP complement, only ever PP and clausal type complements. And furthermore, just like nouns, they are pre-modified by adverbial phrases rather than post-modified as a verb can be. However, like verbs, they have other properties. When they're used as predicates, then it's their arguments that we find in the specifier of the AP, just like we see with verb phrases, arguments sit in the VP specifier. Furthermore, they are morphologically like verbs in as much as they move to inflectional heads of the functional head that sits above them. That is the degree adverb head when it's a comparative or a superlative bound morpheme like or est. That's exactly the way a verb works when it moves to the tense position in the inflection, which is a functional head taking the VP as its complement, same as a degree adverb is a functional head taking an AP as its complement. So we can see there some very similar properties to verbs with adjectives. Finally, we've argued for the presence of this degree phrase as a functional projection above the AP. It's very much like the DP is to the NP and the IP is to the VP. That is, it's a functional phrase that sits on top of the thematic category of AP, just like DP sits above an NP and an IP sits above a VP. Like other functional heads, degree heads only have one kind of complement. That is always an AP. Complementizers always take an IP complement. I always takes a VP complement. D always takes an NP complement. And DEG always takes an AP complement. So we have a very uniform system here. For every thematic type of head, like a noun or a verb or an adjective, there is a specific kind of functional projection above it. And for the adjectival phrase, that's a degree phrase. Okay, that's all there is for this week, and I'll see you next. Bye bye.